Hello, my name is Nigel Thorne. I'm from Wales and I have concerns about the Welsh Government's Relationships and Sexuality Education Code. I'm not the only one to have concerns. The Relationships and Sexuality Education Code is a document that the Welsh Government has published for schools. It contains the mandatory elements that must be taught as part of the new Relationships and Sexuality Education RSE curriculum. Schools must create their own curriculum based on the code. Now, the code comprises three strands: relationships and identity, sexual health and well-being, empowerment, safety and respect. Much of the strand related to relationships and identity has been informed by queer theory, an ideology born in American academia. This ideology seeks to downplay the significance of biological sex and exaggerate the significance of gender, more specifically, gender identity. Biological sex is a fundamental and immutable aspect of every higher order animal. I doubt that 10 years ago most of you had even heard of the term gender identity. This ideology has had a massive influence on our institutions, partly because it is marketed as being inclusive, which is presumably why the Welsh Government has bought into it, and partly because it is aggressively promoted, helped by huge amounts of money supplied by wealthy backers. Many people are concerned about the implications of the teaching of this ideology on the psychological well-being of children. There's been a large increase in the number of children identifying as trans or non-binary in general. More specifically, there's been a large increase in the number of children referred to the Gender Identity Service Clinic, GIDS. On the 10th of March this year, an interim report on a review of the gender identity services for young people conducted by Dr. Hilary Cass was published. Dr. Cass made reference to this recent huge increase. 72 children were referred in 2009 to 2010. 10 years later, that number was 2,590. The trajectory is upwards, steeply upwards. Most of the new cohort of young patients transitioned at or shortly after puberty, and many had comorbid conditions. 35% referred had mild to severe autistic traits or other types of neurodiversity. The majority were same-sex attracted or bisexual. 5% were looked after children. Almost 4% were adopted. Many had complex mental health histories. Now, many people believe that there is a connection between the promotion of this ideology and the increasing numbers of children seeking to medically change their bodies. And yet this is a mandatory part of the curriculum, that this ideology be taught in Welsh schools. So here is the Relationships and Sexuality Education Code. The Curriculum for Wales, Relationships and Sexuality Education Code. This should encompass sex education for children, but surprisingly, within the code, there is no mention at all of the words male, female, man, woman, boy or girl. There are, however, 17 references to the word gender. Now, the word gender has two definitions in relation to men and women. These definitions are in the Oxford English Dictionary. One is as a synonym for sex. This is the biological perspective. Now, there's a note here that states, in the 20th century, as sex came increasingly to mean sexual intercourse, gender began to replace it in early use euphemistically as the usual word for the biological grouping of males and females. There is a story, which may be apocryphal, that on official forms next to the box marked sex, some jokers would put, "Yes, please." So to circumvent that problem, on official forms, the word sex was replaced with the word gender. So there's a second definition of gender just underneath. Psychology and sociology, originally from the United States, Gender is the state of being male or female as expressed by social or cultural distinctions and differences rather than biological ones. The collective attributes or traits associated with a particular sex or determined as a result of one's sex. So these are the social expectations of the roles, behaviours of a person based on their sex. This is the sociological aspect. So if we turn back to the RSE Code, we learn that in phase 1 from age 3, we learn that pupils should be taught to respect others whatever their gender. As gender is a synonym for sex, it is plain what that means. In phase 2 from age 7, we learn that pupils should be taught the importance of sex and gender equality. So if gender is a synonym for sex, why does the code refer to both sex and gender? This is confusing. So fortunately, there is further advice on the Welsh Government website on designing your curriculum. If we can find it, here we go. Sex is defined as attributed to a person on the basis of primary sex characteristics, genitalia, and reproductive functions. Well, sex isn't attributed to a person. Sex is a fundamental aspect of every higher order animal. It is an immutable aspect of ourselves. Gender here is defined as often used to refer to whether someone identifies as male, female, or non-binary. A person cannot identify into a sex category. Sex is immutable. If a person of one sex believes they should be another, they are suffering with gender dysphoria, a condition where a person experiences discomfort or distress because there's a mismatch between their biological sex and gender identity. This is a mental health condition. Right, so there's no reference to the words male and female in the code. And in the Designing a Curriculum page on the Hub website, there's no reference to the words male and female other than as defining these words as gender identities. So this is an additional definition of gender that relates to how one feels inside, which obviously undermines the Oxford English definition where gender is a synonym for sex. This is confusing. So to clarify this, we can look at the recommendations of the Education Expert Panel. They produced a document titled Informing the Future of the Sex and Relationships Education Curriculum in Wales. This is the source document that forms the basis of the RSE Code. Now, the document includes a definition of sex in the glossary that states, sex is used in this report to refer to the biological processes and attributes that societies use to assign sex categories, e.g. male, female, intersex. These biological attributes include chromosomes, hormones, and internal and external physical, sexual, and reproductive anatomy. Societies don't assign sex categories. Sex categories are there. They're an aspect of every higher order animal. The document also includes a definition of gender. That states, gender is used in this report to refer to how sexed bodies are lived, e.g. as identity, as expression, through social interaction, represented, e.g. in language, media, popular culture, and regulated, e.g. by social cultural norms such as the stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, and in law. While the concept gender can include the different ways societies assign chromosomes or body parts to sex categories, It is not synonymous with sex and does not only refer to gender identity or gender expression. It is a concept that allows for analyses of gender as an organising principle of society, e.g., how gender shapes and is shaped by economic, environmental, political, cultural, legal, historical, religious and spiritual factors. As a concept, it also enables an exploration of how different societies address the intersection of biological, social, cultural, and psychological processes. So if teachers can make sense of that, good luck to them. It shouldn't need to be stated. Societies don't assign chromosomes or body parts to sex categories. Biological sex is a fundamental aspect of every higher order animal. If we couldn't speak, if we didn't have the language, we'd still reproduce. In this definition, gender is not synonymous with sex. So the Welsh Government instruction for RSE teaching is that schools should add another definition of gender that is not in the Oxford English Dictionary. Gender is what we feel we are. Schools should disregard one definition of gender that is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary. It is no longer to be regarded as synonymous with sex. And schools should change another definition of gender that is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary, that which describes the social expectations of roles and behaviours based on sex, to the social expectations based on how people behave, look or dress. This assertion seems to imply that the social expectations of a woman will change if she swaps a skirt for a pair of trousers. If you think that this teaching is bordering on the Orwellian, you'd be right. So where does all this come from? The chair of the Sex and Relationships expert panel was Professor Emma Renold, an academic from Cardiff University. In 2006, an article of hers was published in the British Journal of Sociology of Education. The article was titled, "They Won't Let Us Play Unless You're Going Out With Them. Girls, Boys and Butlers' Heterosexual Matrix in the Primary Years." Professor Renold is a great fan of Judith Butler, who is regarded as one of the founders of queer theory, a praxis-based philosophy that aims to undermine heteronormativity, the perception that to be normal, boys must be masculine and sexually attracted to girls, and girls must be feminine and sexually attracted to boys. In her highly influential work, Gender Trouble, Butler referred to this as the heteronormative matrix. Those children who don't fit into this matrix are at risk of being ridiculed, and we can have some sympathy with that. Butler quotes French philosopher Monique Wittig, who argues that the straight, the heterosexual mind, is oppressive because it takes for granted that what founds society is heterosexuality. Butler writes, "The naming of sex is an act of domination and compulsion, an institutionalized performative that both creates and legislates social reality by requiring the discursive perceptual construction of bodies in accord with principles of sexual difference. Hence," Wittig concludes, "we are compelled in our bodies and our minds to correspond feature by feature with the idea of nature that has been established for us. Men and women are political categories and not natural facts. Sex, the category, compels sex, the social configuration of bodies, through what Wittig calls a coerced contract. Hence, the category of sex is a name that enslaves. Language casts sheaves of reality upon the social body, but these sheaves are not easily discarded." She continues, "stamping it and violently shaping it." Wittig argues that the straight mind, evident in the discourses of the human sciences, oppress all of us, lesbians, women and homosexual men, because they take for granted that what founds society, any society, is heterosexuality. Butler also believes that gender is performative, so that the way we express our gender influences the way those around us respond to us. To undermine this matrix, Butler proposes the dissemination of teaching that reduces the significance of sex and elevates the significance of gender. Professor Renold ends her article with something of a mission statement. The heteronormativity of gender relations in the early years is certainly ripe for some gender trouble, and some of this work is well underway and radically disrupting a range of gender and sexual truths in what might be more fittingly described as the heteroformative years. Professor Renold is a woman on a crusade. She is certainly focused on disrupting a range of gender and sexual truths. Professor Renold was invited to chair the Sex and Relationships Education SRE expert panel in March 2017. In December of that same year, the panel published a number of recommendations. The first recommendation was that this teaching be made a statutory part of the curriculum, and that sex and relationships education should be renamed Sexuality and Relationships Education, following World Health Organization guidelines that define sexuality as a central aspect of being human throughout life and encompasses sex, gender identities and roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy and reproduction. These recommendations were accepted by the Welsh Government, and this is what will be expected to be taught to children in Welsh schools. Professor Renold has produced resources for use by teachers in Wales that can be found on Hwb, the Welsh Government education site. The resources are interactive. They can be downloadable as PDF documents. One is called Primary Gender, that's for use with children from the ages of 7 to 11, and the other is Gender, that's to be used with children from the ages 11 to 16. The Welsh Government are encouraging teachers to use primary agenda. Kirsty Williams, the former Education Minister, sang its praises in 2019, and Jeremy Miles, the current Education Minister, fully supported it.
It's really important to me that we ensure that children and young people in Wales grow up to be healthy, confident and compassionate individuals. And today we see the launch of Cardiff University's Primary Agenda. These are free teaching resources for those that are working in our primary schools with children aged 7 to 11 to help deliver really important, exciting and engaging relationships education. I hope that our teachers will really engage with these resources, and I want to say a huge thank you to everybody that has been involved. By working together on these important lessons, we can realise the dream of children growing up to be healthy, confident, compassionate individuals. So please follow along, and a huge thank you to everyone that's been involved.
Professor Renold's work has been well received and has led to her picking up a prestigious award. Agenda has been approved by Cardiff University, the NSPCC, the former Children's Commissioner in Wales, Welsh Women's Aid, and the Welsh Government. With such backing, no doubt, teachers will feel comfortable using this resource. However, there are a number of problems with Primary Agenda, not the least being, it is factually inaccurate regarding the legal protections for gender identity. It is factually inaccurate about children's rights relating to gender identity. It is factually inaccurate about the science underlying gender identity. It seems that in her enthusiasm to downplay the significance of biological sex and exaggerate the significance of gender, Professor Renold has been less than truthful. In a section on Sam's story, the resource states that identity-based bullying refers to any form of bullying related to the characteristics considered part of a person's identity or perceived identity group. This can include their disability, gender, gender identity, race, religion or belief, or sexual orientation. These are referred to as protected characteristics by the Equality Act 2010. There are 9 protected characteristics covered by the Equality Act. They do not include gender or gender identity. As the Equality and Human Rights Commission explain, these cover the characteristics of prejudice-based bullying in schools. Transgender identity is included in a separate piece of legislation related to hate crime. The resource states that children have a right to an identity, including a gender identity. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child does not mention gender identity. The section that references the term identity reads, Article 8.1, states parties undertake to respect the right of the child to preserve his or her identity, including nationality, name and family relations, as recognised by law without unlawful interference. Article 8.1 provides as examples of a child's identity those facets of a child's experience that are external to the child and root them in their family, community and country. In contrast, gender identity is highly personal. Professor Renold's reference may refer to an updated implementation handbook prepared for UNICEF. The handbook adds other potential elements of identity, including gender identity. Advice given in this handbook has no legal standing. In 2018, it was reported that the author of the handbook was jailed for the rape of a 13-year-old boy. Leaving aside the question as to why it is thought appropriate to take instruction on children's rights from the rapist of a 13-year-old boy, anyone who claims rights is insisting that everyone else has an obligation to uphold those rights. If children have a right to a gender identity, then others have an obligation to recognise that identity. In August 2021, it was reported that a boy in a secondary school in Rhondda and Taff was socially affirmed without his parents' knowledge. The child's name and the pronouns used to refer to him were changed. Teachers were following advice in the Council's Transgender Toolkit for secondary schools. The Council only backed down after the threat of legal challenge. Academics, politicians and activists appear to think that they know better than parents. In reference to social transitioning, the CAST report stated, "It is important to view it as an active intervention because it may have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning. The school's actions and the assertion that a child has a human right to a self-declared gender identity is a contravention of Article 5 on the Conventions of the Right of the Child. States parties shall respect the responsibilities, rights and duties of parents, or, where applicable, the members of the extended family or community, as provided for by local custom, legal guardians, or other persons legally responsible for the child, to provide, in a manner consistent with the evolving capacities of the child, appropriate direction and guidance in the exercise by the child of the rights recognised in the present convention. Children cannot possibly have the capacity to be aware of the social-cultural influences on their psychology, nor of the lifelong implications of future medical intervention. An ideological agenda is being pushed on our children and parental concerns are being ignored." The resource states gender identity is used in this resource to refer to a person's inner sense of self. gender identity does not necessarily relate to the sex a person's assigned at birth. Feelings about gender identity start early, about the age of 2 to 3. Sex is not assigned at birth. Sex is determined at conception. The statement regarding feelings about gender identity starting at 2 to 3 is not based on fact. It is based on an hypothesis. The hypothesis is that gender identity is innate. This is an hypothesis that is spouted as fact by Stonewall, the LGBT plus lobby group. It is spouted as fact by the trans lobby group GIDS. And if you use Hub to search for transgender, you will find a resource for teachers called Understanding Gender Variance and Transgender. If you launch Lesson Plan 3, you'll find a link to GIDS documents named Transphobic Bullying. The link no longer exists, but the document can be retrieved from archive. In the document is an image of 2 babies in the womb. One is labelled as a baby who identifies as a girl but looks like a boy. The other is labelled as a baby who identifies as a boy but looks like a girl. Material referenced on Hub is telling teachers that babies can be born in the wrong body. This hypothesis is particularly bad science. The scientific method requires an hypothesis to be falsifiable. It needs to be able to be tested. Subjective feelings cannot be tested. They cannot be falsified. Moreover, the hypothesis depends on the acceptance of socially expected gender roles and behaviours. They provide a frame of reference. Without such a frame of reference, how can anyone possibly know what gender they identify as? An alternative hypothesis is that rather than being innate, gender identity is created as a response to the policing of gender non-conforming behaviour. Consider a 3-year-old boy who likes playing with dolls. The father says, "Don't play with dolls, play with trucks. Boys, play with trucks." The 3-year-old isn't cognitively aware of any significant difference between boys and girls other than they play with different toys. He likes playing with dolls. So he says, "I'm a girl." That statement is not a profession of an internal gender identity. That statement is a justification for him playing with dolls in response to a challenge. Now, if that statement's affirmed by external authority, then that belief may be concretized. Ironically, in Gender Trouble, Judith Butler wrote, "There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results." Her remark is much more in line with the second hypothesis than it is with the first. So, back to the Relationships and Sexuality Education Code. Under the Relationships and Identity section of the Code, it says in Phase 1 from age 3, we learn that pupils should be taught to respect others whatever their gender. So, imagine seeing this from the perspective of a teacher. I've just learned from a resource referenced on Hub that babies can be born in the wrong body. I've just learned from the primary agenda that children have a right to a gender identity. And I just read the definition of gender supplied by the Welsh Government, that gender is what someone identifies as. So the Welsh Government requires me to teach 5-year-olds, say, respect for others whatever their gender. So I look around for material that will help children be aware of others' gender identity. Many local authorities and schools have links with Stonewall, and Stonewall provide a list of recommended reading material for primary schools. Among the many books that Stonewall recommend that promote the message that babies can be born in the wrong body is I Am Jazz. I Am Jazz is recommended reading for children from the age of 5 to 7. It is a jolly and sunny story of a boy who transitioned. Let's call him Jacob. At a very young age, Jacob liked pink. He liked dressing up in his sister's clothes, and he liked dancing. At the age of 5, Jacob socially transitioned and became Jazz. Thereafter, he was treated as if he were a girl. What is not in the book is that Jazz started taking drugs to block his puberty at age 11. At the age of 18, he had an artificial vagina, a hole, surgically created in his body using his inverted penis, surgically patched with a piece of his colon. He has been castrated, he is sterilised. As Jazz never entered male puberty, he'll never experience sexual pleasure. He'll need to take female sex hormones for the rest of his life. He needs to use a dilator regularly to prevent the hole from sealing up. He's likely to suffer side effects as a result of the drugs he has taken, including loss of bone density that may lead to osteoporosis. In the book, Jazz states, "I have a girl brain in a boy's body. I was born this way." Jacob could have grown up to be an effeminate gay man if he hadn't been led to believe that boys and girls behaved in different ways. His body has been irreversibly damaged. Imagine if that was your child, or grandchild, or niece, or nephew. Imagine if your 5-year-old child was taught that babies can be born in the wrong body. That such material may be read to young children in Wales is shocking. The information provided in Primary Agenda is misleading. The resource provided for secondary school pupils is much, much worse. The material is highly political, one-sided, and links to resources that encourage children to reflect on their gender and tell their teachers to refer to them with their gender. A joke circulating on social media compares gender dysphoria to a bad joke. If you think about it long enough, you'll eventually get it. An organisation, Public Child Protection Wales, is challenging the new curriculum, and they're currently fundraising to raise money for a judicial review of the new curriculum due to take place in November. Links are included below.